I call this a conscious agent, this technical thing. Now, Annika Harris and I have talked about this, and she rightly cautions me that people will think that I'm bringing in a notion of a self or agency and so forth when I say conscious agent. So I just want to say that I use the term conscious agent merely as a technical term. There is no notion of self in my fundamental definition of a conscious agent. There are only experiences and probabilistic relationships of how they trigger other experiences.
So the agent is the generator of the conscious experience?
The agent is a mathematical structure that includes a probability measure, a probability space of possible conscious experiences, and a Markovian kernel, which describes how, if this agent has certain conscious experiences, how that will affect the experiences of other conscious agents.
Okay.
Including itself.
But you don't think of that as a self?
No, there is no notion of a self here. There's no notion of really of an agent.
But is there a locality? Is there an organism?
No space.
There's no.
So these are conscious units, conscious entities.
But they're distinct in some way because they have to interact.
Well, so here's the interesting thing. When we write down the mathematics, when you have two of these conscious agents interacting, the pair satisfy a definition of a conscious agent. So they are a single conscious agent. So there is one conscious agent.
Yeah.
But it has a nice analytic decomposition into as many conscious agents.
So that's a nice interface.
It's a very useful scientific interface. It's a scale-free, or if you like, a fractal-like approach to it, in which we can use the same unit of analysis at all scales in studying consciousness. But if I want to talk about, so there's no notion of learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, self, agency. So none of that is fundamental. So, and the reason I did that was because I want to assume as little as possible. Everything I assume is a miracle in the theory. It's not something you explain, it's something you assume. So I have to build networks of conscious agents. If I want to have a notion of a self, I have to build a self. I have to build learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, and planning, all these different things. I have to build networks of conscious agents to do that. It's a trivial theorem that networks of conscious agents are computationally universal. That's trivial. So anything that we can do with neural networks or automata, you can do with networks of conscious agents. That's trivial. But you can also do more. The events in the probability space need not be computable. So the Markovian dynamics is not restricted to computable functions because the very events themselves need not be computable. So this can capture any computable theory. Anything we can do with neural networks, we can do with conscious agent networks. But it leaves open the door for the possibility of non-computable interactions between conscious agents. So we have to if we want a theory of memory, we have to build it. And there's lots of different ways you could build. We've actually got a paper, Chris Fields took the lead on this, and we have a paper called Conscious Agent Networks where Chris takes the lead and shows how to use these networks of conscious agents to build memory and to build primitive kinds of learning.
But can you provide some intuition of what networks of conscious agents helps you? First of all, what that looks like. And I don't just mean mathematically. Of course, maybe that might help build up intuition, but how that helps us potentially solve the hard problem of consciousness.
Right.
Or is that baked in, that exists? Can you solve the hard problem of consciousness? Why it tastes delicious when you eat a delicious ice cream with networks of conscious agents? Or is that taken as an assumption?
So the standard way the hard problem is thought of is we're assuming space and time in particles, or neurons, for example. These are just physical things that have no consciousness. And we have to explain how the conscious experience of the taste of chocolate could emerge from those. So that's the typical hard problem of consciousness is that problem, right? How do you boot up the taste of chocolate, the experience of the taste of chocolate from neurons, say, or the right kind of artificial intelligence circuitry? How do you boot that up? That's typically what the hard problem of consciousness means to researchers. Notice that I'm changing the problem. I'm not trying to boot up conscious experiences from the dynamics of neurons or silicon or something like that. I'm saying that that's the wrong problem. My hard problem would go in the other direction. If I start with conscious experiences, how do I build up space and time? How do I build up what I call the physical world? How do I build up what we call brains? Because I'm saying consciousness is not something that brains do. Brains are something that consciousness makes up. It's one among the experience. It's an ephemeral experience in consciousness. I look inside. So to be very, very clear, right now I have no neurons. If you looked, you would see neurons. That's a data structure that you would create on the fly, and it's a very useful one. As soon as you look away, you garbage collect that data structure. Just like that Necker cube that I was talking about on the piece of paper. When you look, you see a 3D cube. You create it on the fly. As soon as you look away, that's gone.
When you say you mean a human being scientist.
Right now, that's right. More generally, it'll be conscious agents, because as you pointed out, am I asking for a theory of consciousness only about humans? No, it's consciousness, which human consciousness is just a tiny sliver.
So, but you are saying that that's a useful data structure. How many other data structures are there? That's why I said you, human. If there's another Earth, if there's another alien civilization and doing these kinds of investigations, would they come up with similar data structures?
Probably not.
What is the space of data structures, I guess, is what I'm asking.
My guess is that if consciousness is fundamental, if consciousness is all there is, then the only thing that mathematical structure can be about is possibilities of consciousness. And that suggests to me that there could be an infinite variety of consciousnesses, and a vanishingly small fraction of them use space-time data structures, and the kinds of structures that we use. There's an infinite variety of data structures. Now, this is very similar to something that Max Tegmark has said, but I want to distinguish it. He has his level 4 multiverse idea. He thinks that mathematics is fundamental. And so that's the fundamental reality. And since there's an endless variety of mathematical structures, there's an infinite variety of multiverses, in his view. I'm saying something similar in spirit, but importantly different. There's an infinite variety of mathematical structures, absolutely. But mathematics isn't the fundamental reality in this framework. Consciousness is. And mathematics is to consciousness like bones are to an organism. You need the bones. So mathematics is not divorced from consciousness, but it's not the entirety of consciousness by any means. And so there's an infinite variety of consciousnesses and signaling games that consciousnesses could interact via. And therefore worlds, common worlds, data structures that they can use to communicate. So space and time is just one of an infinite variety. And so I think that what we'll find is that as we go outside of our little space-time bubble, we will encounter utterly alien forms of conscious experience that we may not be able to really comprehend in the following sense. If I ask you to imagine a color that you've never seen before, does anything happen? Right? Nothing happens. Right?
Yeah, no.
Nothing happens, and that's just one color. I'm asking for just a color. We actually know, by the way, that there are women called tetrafemmes who have 4 color receptors, not just 3. And Kimberly Jameson and others who've studied these women have good evidence that they apparently have a new dimension of color experience that the rest of us don't have. So these women are apparently living in a world of color that you and I can't even concretely imagine. No man can imagine them.
Yeah.
And yet they're real color experiences. And so in that sense, I'm saying, now take that little baby step. Oh, there are women who have color experiences that I could never have. Well, that's shocking. Now take that infinite. There are consciousnesses where every aspect of their experiences is like that new color. It's something utterly alien to you. You have nothing like that. And yet these are all possible varieties of conscious experience.
And when you say there's a lot of consciousnesses, is a singular consciousness basically the set of possible experiences you can have in that subjective way, as opposed to the underlying mechanism? Because you say that, having extra color receptor, ability to have new experiences, that's somehow a different consciousness. Is there a way to see that as all the same consciousness, the subjectivity itself?
Right, because when we have two of these conscious agents interacting, the mathematics, they actually satisfy the definition of a conscious agent. So in fact, they are a single conscious agent. So in fact, one way to think about what I'm saying, I'm postulating with my colleagues, Chaitan and Chris and others, Robert Prentner and so forth, there is one big conscious agent, infinitely complicated. But fortunately, we can, for analytic purposes, break it down all the way to, in some sense, the simplest conscious agent, which has one conscious experience. One. This one agent can experience red 35. That's it. That's what it experiences. You can get all the way down to that.
So you think it's possible that consciousness, whatever that is much more, is fundamental, or at least much more in the direction of the fundamental than is space-time as we perceive it?
That's the proposal. And therefore, what I have to do, in terms of the hard problem of consciousness, is to show how dynamical systems of conscious agents could lead to what we call space and time and neurons and brain activity. In other words, we have to show how you get space-time and physical objects entirely from a theory of conscious agents outside of space-time, with the dynamics outside of space-time. So that's, and I can tell you how we plan to do that, but that's the idea.
Okay, so the magic of it, that chocolate is delicious. So there's a mathematical kind of thing that we could say here, how it can emerge within this system of networks of conscious agents, but is there going to be at the end of the proof why chocolate is so delicious? Or no? I guess I'm going to ask different kinds of dumb questions to try to sneak up.
Sure. Oh, well, that's the right question. And when I say that I took conscious experiences as fundamental, what that means is, in the current version of my theory, I'm not explaining conscious experiences where they came from. That's the miracle. That's one of the miracles. So I have two miracles in my theory. There are conscious experiences, like the taste of chocolate, and that there's a probabilistic relationship. When certain conscious experiences occur, others are more likely to occur. Those are the two miracles that
possible to get beyond that and somehow start to chip away at the miracleness of that miracle. That chocolate is still delicious.
I hope so. I've got my hands full with what I'm doing right now, but I can just say at top level how I would think about that. That would get at this consciousness without form. This is really tough, because it's consciousness without form versus the various forms that consciousness takes for the experiences that it has.
Right.
So when I write down a probability space for these conscious experiences, I say, here's a probability space for the possible conscious experiences. Right? It's just like when I write down a probability space for an experiment. Like I'm going to flip a coin twice, right? And I want to look at the probabilities of various outcomes. So I have to write down a probability space. There could be heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, tails, tails. So as any class in probability, you're told, write down your probability space. If you don't write down your probability space, you can't get started. So here's my probability space for consciousness. How do I want to interpret that structure? The structure is just sitting there. There's going to be a dynamics that happens on it, right? Experiences appear and then they disappear, just like heads appears and disappears. So one way to think about that fundamental probability space is that corresponds to consciousness without any content. The infinite consciousness that transcends any particular content.
Well, do you think of that as a mechanism, as a thing, like the rules that govern the dynamics of the thing outside of space-time? Isn't that, if you think consciousness is fundamental, isn't it essentially getting like, it is solving the hard problem, which is like, from where does this thing pop up, which is the mechanism of the thing popping up. Whatever the consciousness is, the different kinds, so on, that mechanism. And also, the question I want to ask is, how how tricky do you think it is to solve that problem? You've solved a lot of difficult problems throughout the history of humanity. There's probably more problems to solve left than we've solved by like an infinity. But along that long journey of intelligent species, when will we solve this consciousness one? Which is one way to measure the difficulty of the problem.
So I'll give two answers. There's one problem I think we can solve, but we haven't solved yet. And that is the reverse of what my colleagues call the hard problem. The problem of how do you start with conscious experiences in the way that I've just described them, in the dynamics, and build up space and time and brains, that I think is a tough technical problem, but it's in principle solvable. So I think we can solve that. So we would solve the hard problem, not by showing how brains create consciousness, but how networks of conscious agents create what we call the symbols that we call brains. So that I think.
But does that allow you to? So that's interesting. That's an interesting idea. Consciousness creates the brain, not the brain creates consciousness. But does that allow you to build the thing?
My guess is that it will enable unbelievable technologies. And I'll tell you why. I think it plugs into the work that the physicists are doing. So this theory of consciousness will be even deeper than the structures that the physicists are finding, like the amplitude. But the other answer to your question is less positive. As I said earlier, I think that there is no such thing as a theory of everything. So that I think that the theory that my team is working on, this conscious agent theory, is just a 1.0 theory. We're using probability spaces and Markovian kernels. I can easily see people now saying, well, we can do better if we go to category theory. And we can get a deeper, perhaps more interesting, and then someone will say, well, now I'll go to topoi theory. And there'll be, so I imagine that there'll be, conscious agents, 5, 10, 3 trillion, 0.0. But I think it will never end. I think ultimately, this question that we sort of put our fingers on of how does the formless give birth to form, to the wonderful taste of chocolate. I think that we will always go deeper and deeper, but we will never solve that. That in some sense, that will be a primitive. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe it's just the limits of my current imagination. So I'll just say my imagination right now doesn't peer that deep. Hopefully, so I don't. By the way, I'm saying this. I don't want to discourage some brilliant 20-year-old who then later on proves me dead wrong. I hope to be proven dead wrong.
Well, just like you said, a century from now, everything we're saying now, everything you're saying, all of your theories will be laughingstock.
Yeah.
They will respect the puzzle-solving abilities and how much we were able to do with so little. But outside of that, it will all be just the silliness will be entertainment for a teenager.
Especially the silliness when we thought that we were so smart and we knew it all.
So it would be interesting to explore your ideas by contrasting. You mentioned Annika Harris. You mentioned Philip Goff. So outside of, if you're not allowed to say the fundamental disagreement is the fact that space-time is fundamental, what are interesting distinctions between ideas of consciousness between you and Annika, for example? You guys have you've been on a podcast together. I'm sure in private you guys have some incredible conversations. So where are some interesting sticking points, some interesting disagreements? Let's say with Annika first. Maybe there'll be a few other people.
Well, Annika and I just had a conversation this morning where we were talking about our ideas, and what we discovered really in our conversation was that we're pretty much on the same page. It was really just
about consciousness.
About consciousness, yeah. Our ideas about consciousness are pretty much on the same page. She rightly has cautioned me when I talk about conscious agents, to point out that the notion of agency is not fundamental in my theory. The notion of self is not fundamental, and that's absolutely true. I can use this network of conscious agents. I now use as a technical term. Conscious agents is a technical term for that probability space with the Markovian dynamics. I can use that to build models of a self and to build models of agency, but they're not fundamental. So she has really been very helpful in helping me to be a little bit clear about these ideas and not say things that are misleading.
Sure. The word, I mean, this is the interesting thing about language, actually, is that language, quite obviously, is an interface to truth. It's so fascinating that individual words can have so much ambiguity, and the specific choices of a word within a particular sentence, within the context of a sentence, can have so much, such a difference in meaning. It's quite fascinating, especially when you're talking about topics like consciousness, because it's a very loaded term. It means a lot of things to a lot of people, and the entire concept is shrouded in mystery. So combination of the fact that it's a loaded term and that there's a lot of mystery, people can just interpret it in all kinds of ways. So you have to be both precise and help them avoid getting stuck on some kind of side road of miscommunication, lost in translation because you used the wrong word. That's interesting. I mean, because for a lot of people, consciousness is ultimately connected to a self. I mean, that's our experience of consciousness is connected to this ego. I mean, what else could it possibly be? I can't even, how do you begin to comprehend, to visualize, to conceptualize a consciousness that's not connected to, like, this particular organism?
Well, I have a way of thinking about this whole problem now that comes out of this framework that's different. So we can imagine a dynamics of consciousness, not in space and time, just abstractly. It could be cooperative, for all we know. It could be very friendly. I don't know. And you can set up a Markovian dynamics that is so-called stationary, and that's a technical term, which means that the entropy effectively is not increasing. There is some entropy, but it's constant. So there's no increasing entropy. And in that sense, the dynamics is timeless. There is no entropic time. But it's a trivial theorem, three-line proof, that if you have a stationary Markovian dynamics, any projection that you make of that dynamics by conditional probability, and if you want, I can state a little bit more, even more mathematically precisely for some readers or listeners. But if any projection you take by conditional probability, the induced image of that Markov chain will have increasing entropy. You will have entropic time. So I'll be very, very precise. I have a Markov chain x1, x2 through xn, where n goes to infinity, right? The entropy h, capital H, of xn is equal to the entropy h of xn minus 1 for all n. So the entropy is the same. But it's a theorem that h of xn, say given x sub 1, is greater than or equal to h of xn minus 1 given x1.
Sure. Where does the greater come from?
Because with the theorem of the three-line proof, h of xn given x1 is greater than or equal to h of xn given x1 and x2, because conditioning reduces. But then h of xn minus 1 given x1 comma x2 is equal to h of xn given x2, xn minus 1 given x2 by the Markov property. And then, because it's stationary, it's equal to h of x, I have to write it down. Xn minus,
Sure.
I have to write it. But anyway, there's a three-line proof.
Sure. So, but the assumption of stationarity we're using a lot of terms that people don't understand.
Right, right.
Doesn't matter. So there's some kind of some Markovian dynamics is basically trying to model some kind of system with some probabilities, and there's agents, and they interact in some kind of way, and you can say something about that system as it evolves. Stationarity. Stationary system is one that has certain properties in terms of entropy. Very well, but we don't know if it's stationary or not. We don't know what the properties.
Right.
So you have to kind of take assumptions and see, okay, well, what does the systems behave like under these different properties? The more constraints, the more assumptions you take, the more predictive, the more interesting, powerful things you can say, but sometimes they're limiting. That said, we're talking about consciousness here. How does that? You said cooperative, okay, competitive. I like chocolate. I'm sitting here, I have a brain, I'm wearing a suit. It sure as hell feels like I'm myself. What am I tuning in? Am I plugging into something? Am I a projection, a simple, trivial projection into space-time from some much larger organism that I can't possibly comprehend? How the hell? You're saying
Yes.
You're building up mathematical intuitions. Fine, great, but I'm having an existential crisis here, and I'm gonna die soon. We'll all die pretty quickly, so I want to figure out what chocolate's so delicious. So help me out here. So let's just keep sneaking up to this.
Right. So the whole technical thing was to say this: even if the dynamics of consciousness is stationary, so that there is no entropic time, any projection of it, any view of it, will have the artifact of entropic time. That's a limited resource. Limited resources, so that the fundamental dynamics may have no limited resources whatsoever. Any projection will have certainly time as a limited resource, and probably lots of other limited resources. Hence, we could get competition and evolution and nature red in tooth and claw as an artifact of a deeper system in which those aren't fundamental. And in fact, I take it as something that this theory must do at some point, is to show how networks of conscious agents, even if they're not resource limited, give rise to evolution by natural selection via a projection.
Yeah, but you're saying, I'm trying to understand how the limited resources that give rise to, so first the thing gives rise to time, that gives rise to limited resource, that gives rise to evolution by natural selection, how that has to do with the fact that chocolate is delicious.
Well, it's not going to do that directly. It's going to give to this notion of self.
So, it's going to give you
the notion of self.
The evolution gives you the notion of self.
And also of a self separate from other selves. So the idea would be
that
that
competition has life and death, all those kinds of things.
That's right. So it won't. I don't think, as I said, I don't think that I can tell you how the formless gives rise to the experience of chocolate. Right now, my current theory says that's one of the miracles I'm assuming.
Yeah.
So my theory can't do it. And the reason my theory can't do it is because Hoffman's brain can't do it right now. But the notion of self, yes. The notion of self can be an artifact of the projection of it. So there's one conscious agent. Because anytime conscious agents interact, they form a new conscious agent. So there's one conscious agent. Any projection of that one conscious agent gives rise to time, even if there wasn't any time in that one conscious agent. And it gives rise, now I haven't proven this, so now this is me guessing where the theory is going to go. I haven't done this, there's no paper on this yet. So now I'm speculating. My guess is I'll be able to show, my brighter colleagues working with me will be able to show that we will get evolution by natural selection, the notion of individual cells, individual physical objects, and so forth coming out as a projection of this thing. And that the self, this then will be really interesting in terms of how it starts to interact with certain spiritual traditions, right? Where they will say that there is a notion of self that needs to be let go, which is this finite self that's competing with other selves to get more money and prestige and so forth. That self, in some sense, has to die. But there's a deeper self, which is the timeless being that precedes, not precludes, but precedes any particular conscious experiences, the ground of all experience. That there's that notion of a deep capital self, but our little capital lowercase s selves could be artifacts of projection, and it may be that what consciousness is doing in this framework is right is projected itself down into a self that calls itself Don and a self that calls itself Lex, and through conversations like this, it's trying to find out about itself and eventually transcend the limits of the Don and Lex little icons that it's using, and that little projection of itself. Through this kind of conversation, somehow it's learning about itself.
So that thing dressed me up today.
Yes.
In order to understand itself.
And in some sense, you and I are not separate from that thing, and we're not separate from each other.
Yeah. Well, I have to question the fashion choices on my end then. All right. So you mentioned you agree on, in terms of consciousness, on a lot of things with Hanukkah. Is there somebody, friend or friendly foe, that you disagree with in some nuanced, interesting way or some major way about consciousness, about these topics of reality that you return to often? It's like Christopher Hitchens with Rabbi David Wolpe have had interesting conversations through years that added to the complexity and the beauty of their friendship. Is there somebody like that that over the years has been a source of disagreement with you, that strengthened your ideas?
My ideas have been really shaped by several things. One is the physicalist framework that my scientific colleagues, almost to a person, have adopted, and that I adopted too. The reason I walked away from it was because it became clear that we couldn't start with unconscious ingredients and Buddha consciousness.
Can you define physicalist in contrast to reductionist?
So a physicalist, I would say, is someone who takes space-time and the objects within space-time as ontologically fundamental.
Right, and then reductionist is saying the smaller, the more fundamental.
That's a methodological thing. That's saying within space-time, as you go to smaller and smaller scales in space, you get deeper and deeper laws, more and more fundamental laws. And the reduction of temperature to particle movement was an example of that. But I think that the reason that worked was almost an artifact of the nature of our interface.
That was for a long time, and your colleagues, including yourself, were physicalists, and now you broke away.
Broke away because I think you can't start with unconscious ingredients and boot up consciousness. And
so even with Roger Penrose, where there's like a gray area.
Right. And here's the challenge I would put to all of my friends and colleagues who are, give one specific conscious experience that you can boot up. Right? So if you think that it's integrated information, and this I've asked this of Giulio Tononi a couple times, back in the 90s and then just a couple years ago. I asked Giulio, okay, so great integrated information. So we're all interested in explaining some specific conscious experiences. So what is, pick one, the taste of chocolate. What is the integrated information precise structure that we need for chocolate, and why does that structure have to be for chocolate, and why is it that it could not possibly be vanilla? I asked him, is there any one specific conscious experience that you can account for? Because notice, they've set themselves the task of booting up conscious experiences from physical systems. That's the task they've set themselves.
But that doesn't mean they're, I understand your intuition, but that doesn't mean they're wrong just because they can't find a way to boot it up yet.
That's right. No, that doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that they haven't done it. I think it's principle. The reason is principle, but I'm happy that they're exploring it. But the fact is, the remarkable fact is, there's not one theory. So integrated information theory, orchestrated collapse of microtubules, global workspace theory.
These are all theories of consciousness.
These are all theories of consciousness. There's not a single theory that can give you a specific conscious experience, that they say, here is the physical dynamics or the physical structure that must be the taste of chocolate or whatever one they want.
So you're saying it's impossible. They're saying it's just hard.
Yeah. I mean, my attitude is, okay, no one said you had to start with neurons or physical systems and boot up consciousness.
You guys are just taking
You
that.
chose that problem. So since you chose that problem, how much progress have you made? Well, when you've not been able to come up with a single specific conscious experience, and you've had these brilliant people working on it for decades now, that's not really good progress.
Let me ask you to play devil's advocate. Can you try to steel man meaning argue the best possible case for reality, the opposite of your book title? So, or maybe just sticking to consciousness. Can you take the physicalist view? Can you steel man the physicalist view for a brief moment, playing devil's advocate too, or steel man the person you used to be?
Right.
The physicalist. What's a good, like saying that you might be wrong right now? What would be a convincing argument for that?
Well, I think the argument I would give and that I believed was, look, when you have very simple physical systems, like a piece of dirt, there's not much evidence of life or consciousness. It's only when you get really complicated physical systems, like that have brains, and really the more complicated the brains, the more it looks like there's consciousness, and the more complicated that consciousness is. Surely that means that simple physical systems don't create much consciousness, or if maybe not any, or maybe if panpsychists, they create the most elementary kinds of simple conscious experiences. But you need more complicated physical systems to boot up, to create more complicated consciousnesses. I think that's the intuition that drives most of my colleagues.
And you're saying that this concept of complexity is ill-defined when you ground it to space-time.
Well, I think it's well defined within the framework of space-time, right?
No, it's ill-defined relative to what you need to actually understand consciousness, because you're grounding complexity in space-time.
Oh, gotcha. Right. Yeah. What I'm saying is, if it were true that space-time was fundamental, then I would have to agree that if there is such a thing as consciousness, given the data that we've got, that complex brains have consciousness and dirt doesn't, that somehow it's the complexity of the dynamics or organization, the function of the physical system that somehow is creating the consciousness. So under those assumptions, yes. But when the physicists themselves are telling us that space-time is not fundamental, then I can understand. See, then the whole picture starts to come into focus. Why my colleagues are brilliant, right? These are really smart people. I mean, Francis Crick worked on this for the last 20 years of his life. These are not stupid people. These are brilliant, brilliant people. The fact that we've come up with not a single specific conscious experience that we can explain, and no hope. There's no one that says, oh, I'm really close, so I'll have it for you in a year. No, there's just like, there's this fundamental gap. So much so that Steve Pinker, in one of his writings, says, look, he likes the global workspace theory. But he says the last dollop of the theory, in which there's something it's like to, he said we may have to just stipulate that as a brute fact. I mean, and Pinker is brilliant, right? He understands the state of play on this problem of the hard problem of consciousness, starting with physicalist assumptions and then trying to put up consciousness. When you set yourself the problem, I'm starting with physical stuff that's not conscious. I'm trying to get the taste of chocolate out as maybe some kind of function of the dynamics of that. We've not been able to do that. And so Pinker is saying we may have to punt. We may have to just stipulate that last bit, or he calls it the last dollop, and just stipulate it as a bare fact of nature that there is something that's like. Well, from my point of view as the whole point, the whole promise of the physicalist was we wouldn't have to stipulate. I was going to start with the physical stuff and explain where the consciousness came from. If I'm going to stipulate consciousness, why don't I just stipulate consciousness and not stipulate all the physical stuff too? Sure. So I'm stipulating less. I'm saying, okay, I agree.
It's the panpsychist perspective.
Well, it's actually what I call the conscious realist perspective. Panpsychists are effectively dualists, right? They're saying there's physical stuff that really is fundamental, and then consciousness stuff. So I would go with Pinker and say, look, let's just stipulate the consciousness stuff. But I'm not going to stipulate the physical stuff. I'm going to actually now show how to boot up the physical stuff from just the consciousness stuff. So I'll stipulate less.
Is it possible, so if you stipulate less, is it possible for our limited brains to visualize reality as we delve deeper and deeper and deeper? Is it possible to visualize somehow? With the tools of math, with the tools of computers, with the tools of our mind, are we hopelessly lost? You said there's ways to intuit what's true using mathematics and probability and Markovian dynamics, all that kind of stuff, but that's not visualizing. That's a kind of building intuition. But is it possible to visualize in the way we visualize so nicely in space-time in 4 dimensions, in 3 dimensions? Sorry. Well, we really are looking through a 2-dimensional screen until it's what we intuit to be a 3-dimensional world, and also inferring dynamic stuff, making it 4D. Anyway, is it possible to visualize some pretty pictures that give us a deeper sense of the truth of reality?
I think that we will incrementally be able to do that. I think that, for example, the picture that we have of electrons and photons interacting and scattering it may have not been possible until Faraday did all of his experiments and then Maxwell wrote down his equations, and we were then sort of forced by his equations to think in a new way. And then when Planck in 1900, desperate to try to solve the problem of black body radiation, what they call the ultraviolet catastrophe, where Newton was predicting infinite energies where there weren't infinite energies in black body radiation. And he, in desperation, proposed packets of energy. Then once you've done that, and then you have an Einstein come along 5 years later and show how that explains the photoelectric effect. And then eventually in 1926 you get quantum theory. And then you get this whole new way of thinking that was, from the Newtonian point of view, completely contradictory and counterintuitive, certainly. Yeah, and maybe if Jason is right, not contradictory. Maybe if you use intuitionist math, they're not contradictory. But still, certainly you wouldn't have gone there. And so here's a case where the experiments and then a desperate mathematical move, sort of we use those as a flashlight into the deep fog. Right, and so that science may be the flashlight into the deep fog.
I wonder if it's still possible to visualize we talk about consciousness from a self perspective, experience it, hold that idea in our mind, the way you can experience things directly. We've evolved to experience things in this 3D world, and that's a very rich experience. When you're thinking mathematically, you still, in the end of the day, have to project it down to low dimensional space to make conclusions. Your conclusions will be a number, or a line, or a plot, or a visual. So I wonder, how we can really touch some deep truth in a subjective way, experience it, really feel the beauty of it, in the way that humans feel beauty.
Right.
Or are we screwed?
I don't think we're screwed. I think that we get little hints of it from psychedelic drugs and so forth. We get hints that there are certain interventions that we can take on our interface. I apply this chemical, which is just some element of my interface, to this other, to a brain. I ingest it. And all of a sudden, it seems like I've opened new portals into conscious experiences. Well, that's very, very suggestive. That's like the black body radiation doing something that we didn't expect, right? It doesn't go to infinity when we thought it was going to go to infinity, and we're forced to propose these quanta. So once we have a theory of conscious agents and is projection into space-time, I should sketch what I think that projection is. But then I think we can then start to ask specific questions. When you're taking DMT or you're taking LSD or something like that, now that we have this deep model that we've reverse engineered space and time and physical particles, we've pulled them back to this theory of conscious agents. Now we can ask ourselves, in this idealized future, what are we doing to conscious agents when we apply 5-MeO-DMT? What are we doing? Are we opening a new portal, right? So when I say that, I mean, I have a portal into consciousness that I call my body of Lex Friedman that I'm creating. And it's a genuine portal, not perfect, but it's a genuine portal. I'm definitely communicating with your consciousness. And we know that we have one technology for building new portals. We know one technology, and that is having kids. Having kids is how we build new portals into consciousness. It takes a long time.
Can you elaborate that? You mean like
Your son and your daughter didn't exist. That was a portal. You're having contact with consciousness that you never would have had before. But now you've got a son or a daughter. You went through this physical process. They were born. Then there was all the.
But is that portal yours? So when you have kids, are you creating new portals that are completely distinct from the portals that you've created with other consciousness? Like, can you elaborate on that? To which degree are the consciousness of your kids a part of you?
Well, so every person that I see, that symbol that I see, the body that I see, is a portal potentially for me to interact with a consciousness.
Yeah.
And each consciousness has a unique character. We call it a personality, right, and so forth. So with each new kid that's born, we come in contact with a personality that we've never seen before, and a version of consciousness that we've never seen before. At a deeper level, as I said, the theory says there's one agent. So this is a different projection of that one agent. But so